The Silent Prince. The kingdom of Oakhaven was a land built on the cadence of song and the roar of triumph. Its people valued a sharp tongue as much as a sharp sword, and King Aldous, a ruler of booming commands and iron will, believed that a man's worth was measured by the volume of his decree. Yet, in the highest tower of the stone palace, where the ivy clung to the granite like desperate fingers, lived Prince Julian. Julian was the king's firstborn, the rightful heir to the throne, but he was a prince who had never spoken a single word. He was not born deaf, for he could hear the rustle of the autumn leaves, the distant call of the hunting horns, and the whisper of the maids in the corridors. He simply lived in absolute, unbroken silence. The court physicians had tried everything. They had forced him to drink bitter elixirs made of crushed beetles and rare herbs, they had burned pungent incense that made his eyes water, they had even brought in sorcerers who chanted long, droning incantations over his bed. Nothing worked. Julian would only watch them with his deep, analytical hazel eyes, his face a mask of calm serenity. A mute king is no king at all, King Aldous would growl, slamming his goblet onto the heavy oak table. How can a man command an army if he cannot yell the charge? How can he rule a court if he cannot pronounce judgment? Consequently, the king turned his attention and his affection to his second son, Prince Cassian. Cassian was everything Julian was not: loud, boastful, charming, and fiercely competitive. Cassian could recite poetry to the court ladies, rally the guards with a rousing speech, and laugh with a booming resonance that mirrored his father's. The kingdom looked to Cassian as their future, while Julian became a shadow, a ghost pacing the parapets. But Julian did not mind the isolation. While the rest of the castle engaged in the loud, exhausting theater of courtly politics, Julian observed. Because he did not speak, he learned to look. He noticed the slight tremor in the hands of the Grand Vizier, betraying a deep-seated fear. He saw the subtle exchange of coin between a merchant and a guard at the side gate. He understood the language of the world that words so often obscured, the slouch of a shoulder meaning defeat, the quick flash of an eye meaning betrayal, and the soft, lingering glance that meant love. Julian's room was filled with leather-bound journals. In them, he drew meticulous sketches of the flora and fauna of the kingdom, and he wrote poems that no one would ever hear. His hands, long and elegant, were constantly covered in ink. He found his voice on the parchment. One crisp morning, as the fog still hung low over the castle moats, Julian stood on his balcony. He wore a simple tunic of dark green velvet, devoid of the flashy gold embroidery his brother favored. He watched the kingdom wake up. The blacksmith's hammer struck the anvil in a steady, rhythmic heartbeat. The stable boys shouted to one another. Then, the heavy iron gates of the courtyard ground open. A carriage, bearing the crest of the neighboring kingdom of Solis, a golden sun burst, rolled slowly over the drawbridge. Solis was a land of artists, philosophers, and thinkers, a stark contrast to the militaristic Oakhaven. For years, the two kingdoms had maintained a fragile peace, cemented only by trade agreements. The carriage door opened, and a young woman stepped out. Julian's breath caught in his throat. She wore a gown the color of a pale dawn sky, her dark hair falling in soft curls around her shoulders. But it wasn't her beauty that struck him, it was her aura. While everyone else in the courtyard hurried about with an anxious, frantic energy, she stood perfectly still, looking up at the towering castle. Walls with a mixture of awe and profound sadness. This was Princess Aurelia of Solis. She had been sent by her father to live at the Oakhaven court for a season, a political gesture of goodwill, but in reality, a gilded captivity to ensure Solis's compliance with Oakhaven's new border taxes. As if feeling the weight of his gaze, Aurelia looked up. Her blue eyes locked onto Julian's hazel ones. For a long, suspended moment, neither moved. The noise of the courtyard seemed to fade into a dull hum. Julian did not offer a grand bow, nor did he wave. He simply held her gaze, offering a soft, reassuring nod. Aurelia's lips parted slightly in surprise, and then, a small, tentative smile touched her face. In that single, wordless interaction, Julian felt a spark ignite within his quiet world. Chapter 2, The Language of Flowers. The arrival of Princess Aurelia was celebrated with a grand banquet in the Great Hall. The room was ablaze with hundreds of torches, the air thick with the scent of roasted meats and spilled ale. Musicians played lively tunes on lutes and pipes, their songs bouncing off the high stone arches. Julian sat in his usual spot, at the far end of the royal dais, shrouded by the shadows of a large stone pillar. It was his preferred vantage point. It allowed him to see everyone without being forced into the awkward, one-sided conversations the nobles so desperately tried to avoid. King Aldous sat at the center, laughing boisterously at a joke told by Lord Commander Vance. To his right sat Prince Cassian, preening in a tunic of crimson and gold, his eyes fixed entirely on Princess Aurelia, who sat across from him. "Tell me, Princess," Cassian purred, leaning forward and swirling his wine, "is it true that in Solis, your knights write sonnets before they go to battle? We in Oakhaven prefer the song of steel against steel." Aurelia smiled politely, though Julian noticed the slight tension in her jaw. "We believe, Prince Cassian, that a mind well versed in beauty fights harder to protect it. A sword protects the body, but art preserves the soul." Cassian laughed, a rich, dismissive sound. "A beautiful sentiment, milady, but art won't stop a barbarian's axe. You will find Oakhaven a bit more practical." Throughout the night, Cassian monopolized the conversation, showering Aurelia with loud compliments, boasting of his hunting exploits, and promising to show her the grand armory. Aurelia listened gracefully, nodding at the right moments, but Julian could see the exhaustion behind her eyes. She was a captive bird, surrounded by wolves who mistook her elegance for weakness. At one point, Aurelia's eyes wandered away from Cassian's animated gestures and scanned the room. They landed on the dark corner where Julian sat. Julian raised his silver goblet slightly in a silent toast. He did not smile broadly, he simply acknowledged her presence. Aurelia's expression softened. In the midst of the roaring noise, their silent connection remained unbroken. The next afternoon, Julian was in the royal gardens. It was his sanctuary. The garden was a sprawling labyrinth of white stone paths, weeping willows, and vibrant rose bushes. It was the one place where silence was natural, where the only voices belonged to the wind and the birds. He was sitting on a stone bench, sketching a delicate orchid that grew near the greenhouse, when he heard soft footsteps. He looked up to see Aurelia. She wore a simple walking dress, her hair pinned back with a silver clip. She looked surprised to find him there. "Oh, forgive me, Prince Julian," she said, stepping back. "I did not mean to intrude on your privacy." Julian quickly shook his head. He closed his sketchpad, placed it on the bench, and stood up. He extended his hand, gesturing toward the open path, inviting her to walk with him. Aurelia hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Thank you, I would like that." They walked side by side down the gravel path. The silence between them was not the heavy, awkward silence Julian usually experienced with others, the kind filled with clearing throats and nervous glances. It was light, comfortable, like a shared secret. "It is so loud inside the castle," Aurelia admitted softly, looking at the high stone walls. "Everyone is constantly shouting, trying to be heard over one another. I feel as though if I don't speak loudly enough, I will simply disappear." Julian stopped walking. He looked at her, then reached out and gently tapped his own chest, over his heart, and then pointed to her. "I hear you," the gesture said. Aurelia looked at his hand, then up at his eyes. A wave of understanding washed over her. "You do, don't you? You don't need the noise." Julian smiled and turned to a nearby bush of blue delphiniums. He carefully plucked a single stem, blew a small insect off the petal, and handed it to her. Aurelia took the flower, her fingers brushing against his. A jolt of warmth shot through Julian's veins. "Delphiniums," she murmured, admiring the deep blue hue. In the language of flowers, they signify a lightness of heart. And a promise of protection. She looked up, her eyes wide with wonder. "Do you study the language of flowers, Prince?" Julian nodded. He tapped his sketchpad. "May I see?" she asked. He picked up the leather journal and handed it to her. Aurelia opened it, and as she flipped through the pages, her breath hitched. The book was filled with incredibly detailed drawings of the kingdom's landscape, but more than that, it was filled with prose. Words written in an elegant, sweeping script, thoughts on philosophy, observations of human nature, and descriptions of the beauty of the world. "These are beautiful," she whispered, her voice tinged with awe. "Julian, you have so much to say." Julian looked down, a rare flush of embarrassment coloring his cheeks. "Do not hide this," she said gently, closing the book and handing it back. "The world thinks you are empty because you do not speak, but you are fuller than any man I have ever met." From that day forward, the gardens became their meeting place. Every afternoon, away from the prying eyes of the court, the silent prince and the captive princess found a way to speak without words. Chapter 3. The Unspoken Bond. Weeks turned into months, and the seasons began to shift. The vibrant greens of summer gave way to the rich, fiery hues of autumn. The air grew crisp, and the leaves danced across the stone paths of Oakhaven. For Julian, this was the happiest period of his life. His afternoons with Aurelia had become his lifeline. Their communication had evolved into a beautiful, intricate dance. They used a combination of simple gestures, written notes in Julian's journal, and the language of flowers. If Julian felt she was troubled, he would present her with a white rose, symbolizing secrecy and a safe space to share her burdens. If Aurelia wanted to express her gratitude, she would bring him a sprig of sweet alyssum. They also spent hours reading together. They would sit on the stone bench, sharing a book of Solis philosophy. Julian would point to specific passages, and Aurelia would read them aloud, her melodic voice washing over him like a soothing balm. They would discuss the texts through written notes, debating the merits of logic versus emotion. Julian found that Aurelia's mind was sharp, analytical, and deeply compassionate. She did not just see the world, she felt it. One afternoon, a light rain began to fall, forcing them to seek shelter in the old stone gazebo at the edge of the gardens. The rain created a curtain of water around them, isolating them further from the rest of the world. Aurelia wrapped her arms around herself, shivering slightly in the cool breeze. Without a word, Julian took off his heavy wool cloak and draped it gently over her shoulders. The cloak was warm and smelled of cedar and ink. "Thank you," Aurelia said, pulling the fabric tightly around her. She looked out at the rain-streaked gardens. "My father wrote to me yesterday. The political tensions are rising. King Aldous is demanding higher tariffs on our grain. If my father does not agree, Oakhaven may threaten war." Julian's expression grew serious. He took his journal and quickly wrote, "My father is a man of force, but he is not reckless. He knows a war with Solis would drain Oakhaven's coffers." Perhaps, Aurelia sighed, turning to look at him. "But Prince Cassian is eager for glory. He keeps speaking of leading a vanguard into our valleys. He treats the prospect of war like a game, a chance to win medals." Julian's jaw tightened. He knew his brother all too well. Cassian viewed life as a stage, and war was the grandest play of all. Aurelia reached out and placed her hand over Julian's. "I am afraid, Julian. If war comes, I will be a prisoner of war, not a guest. And my people will suffer." Julian looked down at her small, delicate hand resting against his. He turned his palm up, intertwining his fingers with hers. He looked into her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. He didn't need a pen to tell her what he felt. His eyes spoke of an unyielding promise. "I will protect you. I will not let harm come to you or your people." Aurelia's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "I know you will. I trust you more than anyone else in this palace." She leaned forward, her movements slow and deliberate. Julian met her halfway. In the quiet sanctuary of the rain-slicked gazebo, their lips met in a soft, tender kiss. It was a kiss born of silence, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 declarations of love. It was a promise made not in the fleeting breath of words, but in the enduring truth of touch. When they pulled apart, Aurelia rested her forehead against his. "They think you have no voice, Julian. But your silence is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." But their sanctuary was not as hidden as they believed. From the shadows of the corridor overlooking the gardens, Prince Cassian stood by a narrow window. He had been looking for Aurelia to invite her to the evening's hawking tournament. Instead, he had witnessed the entire exchange, the shared looks, the hand-holding, and finally, the kiss. Cassian's face contorted with rage and jealousy. He had assumed Aurelia would eventually fall for his charm and his status as the de facto heir. To see her choose his mute, broken brother was an insult he could not bear. "A ghost stealing my prize," Cassian whispered to himself, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword until his knuckles turned white. "We shall see how much she loves your silence when it costs you everything." Chapter 4. The Shadow of Treason. The atmosphere in the Oakhaven court grew increasingly tense. The talks with Solis had broken down completely, and King Aldous was in a foul mood. War rooms were prepared, maps were laid out across the grand tables, and the sound of blacksmiths sharpening weapons echoed through the night. Julian worked tirelessly in his study. He spent nights drafting alternative trade proposals, compromises that would give Oakhaven the economic advantages it desired without crippling Solis or inciting a war. He used historical precedents and complex economic calculations to prove that a peaceful trade alliance was far more lucrative in the long run than a bloody conquest. He bound the documents neatly and left them on his father's desk in the middle of the night, hoping the king would read them with an open mind. The next morning, Julian was summoned to the Great Hall. When he entered, he found the atmosphere heavy and hostile. King Aldous sat on his throne, his face flushed with anger. Prince Cassian stood by his side, a smug, triumphant smirk on his lips. Lord Commander Vance and several high-ranking guards stood around the room. In the center of the hall stood Princess Aurelia, flanked by 2 guards. She looked pale but held her head high. Julian felt a cold dread sink into his stomach. He stepped forward, his eyes darting between his father and Aurelia. "Ah, the silent prince arrives," King Aldous bellowed, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Come forward, Julian, see the fruit of your intellectual pursuits." The king slammed a stack of papers onto the floor. Julian recognized them instantly, it was his trade proposal. But beside it lay another set of documents. "We found these in the princess's quarters this morning," Cassian spoke up, his voice dripping with false sorrow. "Detailed maps of Oakhaven's border defenses, troop movements, and supply routes. Secrets that only a member of the royal family could access." Julian's eyes widened. He looked at Aurelia, who shook her head frantically. "It's a lie," Aurelia cried out. "I have never seen those maps before. I am no spy." "Silence, girl," King Aldous roared. He then turned his furious gaze upon Julian. "And you, Julian, my own son, these proposals you left on my desk, they match the exact cipher used in these treasonous documents found in her room. Cassian's guards found copies of your own journals hidden with the stolen maps." Julian realized with horrifying clarity what had happened. Cassian had framed them. He had stolen Julian's journals to copy his handwriting and cipher, planted the stolen military maps in Aurelia's room, and presented it all as a grand conspiracy between the mute prince and the foreign princess. Julian stepped forward, desperately trying to use hand gestures to explain, to plead, to point out the logical flaws in the accusation. He gestured to Cassian, his eyes burning with accusation. "Enough with the frantic waving," King Aldous shouted, dismissively. "This is exactly why you are unfit to rule. You cannot even defend yourself against charges of treason. You speak in riddles and shadows." Cassian stepped forward, playing the part of the dutiful, grieving brother. "Father, it is clear that Julian has been manipulated by this Solis temptress. His silence has made his mind weak, easily swayed by her honeyed words and charms. He likely gave her the maps thinking he was securing peace." The king sighed, a heavy, defeated sound. He looked at Julian with a mixture of anger and profound disappointment. "Julian, you are my blood, but I cannot overlook treason. Effective immediately, you are stripped of your royal titles and your right of inheritance. You are confined to the East Tower under house arrest until further notice." Julian froze. His heart hammered against his ribs. He didn't care about the title or the inheritance, but he cared about Aurelia. As for the princess, King Aldous declared, his eyes cold as ice, she will be thrown into the dungeons. We will use her as leverage against Solis. If her father does not surrender his borders within 3 days, she will be executed as a spy. "No," Aurelia screamed as the guards grabbed her arms. She looked at Julian, tears streaming down her face. "Julian." Julian lunged forward to stop the guards, but Lord Commander Vance and 3 strong soldiers blocked his path, tackling him to the stone floor. Julian struggled against them, his silent screams tearing at his throat, but he was pinned down. He watched in agonizing silence as Aurelia was dragged out of the great hall, her desperate cries fading down the corridor. Cassian walked over to where Julian lay pinned to the floor. He knelt down, leaning close so only Julian could hear his whisper. "You should have stayed in your garden, brother," Cassian whispered maliciously. "In the real world, the loud win. She is mine now, and your silence has finally destroyed you." Chapter 5, The Voice of the Soul. The East Tower was cold and damp. The wind howled through the iron bars of the small window, bringing with it the chill of a fast-approaching winter. Julian paced the stone floor of his cell like a caged beast. For the first time in his life, his silence felt like a curse, a heavy iron chain wrapped around his throat. If he had a voice, he could have shouted the truth. He could have exposed Cassian's lies. He could have commanded the guards to stand down. Instead, he was a prisoner of his own biology, helpless while the woman he loved faced execution. He looked out the narrow window. The moon was a sliver of silver in the dark sky. 2 days had passed. Solis had received the king's ultimatum, but King Aldous, pushed by Cassian, was already preparing the execution stage in the central courtyard. They didn't want a surrender, they wanted an excuse for war. Julian sat on the cold stone floor, pulling his knees to his chest. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he let despair wash over him. What can a silent prince do? He thought bitterly. Then, he remembered Aurelia's words. The world thinks you are empty because you do not speak, but you are fuller than any man I have ever met. Your silence is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. She hadn't loved him for his potential to shout, She had loved him for his capacity to understand, to observe, and to love deeply. She believed in his strength. Julian opened his eyes. The despair vanished, replaced by a cold, burning resolve. He could not speak, but he could act. He stood up and examined his cell. The door was solid oak, reinforced with iron bars, guarded by 2 men outside. Escaping by force was impossible. He walked to the window and looked down. The drop was catastrophic, but running along the outer wall of the tower was a thick, ancient vine of ivy, the same ivy he had watched for years. It was thick as a man's arm in some places, deeply rooted into the stone crevices. It was a reckless, desperate gamble. One slip meant death. Julian didn't hesitate. He tore his bedsheets into long, sturdy strips and tied them together, binding one end to the heavy iron bedpost. He threw the other end out the window. He climbed through the narrow opening, the cold wind biting his face. Grasping the makeshift rope, he lowered himself down until his feet found the thick, gnarled branches of the ivy. The stone wall scraped against his hands, drawing blood, but he ignored the pain. Step by step, relying on the strength he had built from years of walking the rugged hills of the kingdom, he climbed down the sheer face of the tower. At one point, a branch snapped under his foot, and he slipped, dangling by his hands for a terrifying second before regaining his footing. Finally, his boots hit the soft earth of the outer moat. He was out. He moved through the shadows of the castle walls like a ghost. He knew the guard rotations better than anyone, he had spent years mapping them. He avoided the torches, slipped through a side maintenance grate, and made his way into the subterranean levels of the castle, the dungeons. The air below was thick with the smell of mold and despair. Julian crept down the damp stone steps, holding a small dagger he had stolen from a guard's belt along the way. As he approached the maximum security cells, he saw 2 guards sitting at a table, drinking ale and playing dice. Julian picked up a heavy iron stone from the floor and threw it down an adjacent corridor. The loud clatter echoed through the silence. "What was that?" one guard asked, standing up and drawing his sword. "Go check it out." As the first guard walked past Julian's hiding spot, Julian lunged out. He didn't use the dagger to kill, instead, he struck the guard precisely on the side of the neck, a technique he had read about in an Eastern combat manual. The guard collapsed instantly, unconscious. The second guard heard the scuffle and turned, but Julian was already upon him. He kicked the table into the guard's chest, knocking him off balance, and followed with a swift, powerful blow to the jaw. The guard hit the stone wall and slid to the floor, knocked out cold. Julian breathed heavily, his hands trembling slightly. He took the ring of keys from the guard's belt and hurried down the row of cells. At the very end, behind a heavy iron grate, he saw her. Aurelia was sitting on a pile of straw, her head resting on her knees. Her dress was soiled, and her face was pale and drawn. Julian inserted the key into the lock. The heavy mechanism turned with a loud click. Aurelia looked up, her eyes widening in disbelief. Julian threw the door open and stepped inside. He dropped to his knees before her, taking her face in his scratched, bloodied hands. He searched her eyes for injuries, his face a mask of intense worry. "You came for me," she whispered, tears spilling over her eyelashes. She threw her arms around his neck, holding him tightly. "I knew you would. I knew it." Julian held her close, burying his face in her hair. But he knew they had no time. He pulled away, took her hand, and pulled her to her feet. He pointed toward the exit. "We have to leave the kingdom," Aurelia said, understanding his urgency. "If we can reach the Solis border, my father's scouts will protect us. We can expose Cassian from there." Julian nodded. They broke out of the dungeon, using the same secret maintenance tunnels Julian had discovered as a boy. Within an hour, they had slipped past the outer walls and entered the dark, dense woods surrounding Oakhaven. Chapter 6, The Pursuit. They ran through the forest under the cover of night, guided only by the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. Julian led the way, his keen eyes navigating the treacherous terrain. He kept a firm grip on Aurelia's hand, pulling her forward whenever she stumbled. By morning, they had reached the base of the jagged peaks, the treacherous mountain range that formed the natural border between Oakhaven and Solis. The path ahead was steep, narrow, and dangerous, but it was their only hope. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, a distant sound echoed through the valleys. The deep, resonant baying of hunting hounds. Julian stopped, his jaw tightening. He looked back toward the lowlands. Far in the distance, he could see a dust cloud rising from the road. A troop of riders, led by a figure in crimson armor, was fast approaching. Cassian. He had discovered their escape and had taken his elite trackers to hunt them down. Aurelia heard the hounds too. Her face drained of color. They're too fast. We won't make the summit before they catch us. Julian looked at the steep mountain path, then at Aurelia. He knew she was exhausted, her breath ragged, her feet blistered. They could not outrun horses on an open trail. He took his journal from his inner tunic, the one thing he had made sure to grab before escaping. He quickly flipped to a blank page and wrote, "There is an old mining tunnel ahead. It cuts through the mountain. It is dangerous, prone to cave-ins, but it will hide our tracks." From the hounds. Aurelia nodded, her expression resolute. "Lead the way." They hurried up the rocky incline, turning off the main path into a hidden ravine overgrown with thorny briars. Hidden behind a screen of dead trees was the entrance to the forgotten mine, a dark, yawning chasm in the side of the mountain. Julian pulled Aurelia inside just as the distant sound of hoofs grew louder. The air inside the tunnel was freezing and smelled of old earth and sulfur. They moved forward in complete darkness, Julian keeping one hand on the rough stone wall and the other holding Aurelia. Every few steps, small rocks would skitter down from the ceiling, a terrifying reminder of the tunnel's instability. Suddenly, a bright light illuminated the entrance behind them. "They're in here," a voice shouted. "Look at the broken branches at the entrance." It was Cassian's men. The hounds had lost the scent on the stone, but the trackers had found the physical signs of their entry. "Move," Aurelia whispered frantically. They ran blindly through the dark tunnel. The sound of shouting and heavy boots echoed behind them, growing closer by the minute. The tunnel began to slope upward, indicating they were approaching the other side of the mountain. Up ahead, Julian saw a pinprick of light. The exit. But as they neared the opening, a loud, cracking sound reverberated through the cavern. A heavy wooden support beam, rotted by centuries of dampness, groaned under the weight of the shifting mountain above. Julian looked up and saw a massive fissure opening in the stone ceiling directly above the exit path. It was about to collapse. He grabbed Aurelia's waist and flung her forward, throwing her out of the tunnel mouth just as the ceiling gave way. With a deafening roar, tons of rock, earth, and timber crashed down, completely sealing the exit. Aurelia landed hard on the grassy slope outside the tunnel. She scrambled to her feet, turning around to see a solid wall of collapsed boulder where the entrance had been. "Julian," she screamed, battering her hands against the rocks. "Julian, answer me." From the other side of the rubble, Julian lay on the ground, coughing from the thick dust. He was bruised and battered, but miraculously, no heavy rocks had hit him. However, he was trapped inside, and the sound of Cassian's troops approaching from the dark depths of the tunnel was getting closer. He could hear Aurelia's frantic muffled cries from the other side of the collapse. He crawled to a small gap between two massive boulders where a faint sliver of light drifted through from the outside. He pressed his face against it. He could see her hands bleeding as she tried to move a rock 5 times her size. Julian reached his hand through the narrow gap. Aurelia saw his fingers and seized them, tears streaming down her face. "Julian, thank God. Hold on, I'll find a way to get you out." Julian gently squeezed her hand, then shook his head, though she couldn't see his face fully. He knew there was no time. Cassian would be at his position in moments. He pulled his hand back, took a deep breath, and wrote a note on a scrap of paper he tore from his pocket, passing it through the gap. "Run, Aurelia. The Solis border is less than a league down this slope. You can see the guard towers from here. Run to safety. I will hold them off." No, she wept, pressing her forehead against the stone. "I won't leave you. They will kill you." Julian looked back into the darkness of the tunnel. The torches of Cassian's vanguard were now visible, reflecting off the damp walls. He could hear his brother's voice calling out, mocking him. Julian turned back to the gap. He could not write another note. There was no time. For 24 years, Julian had lived in absolute silence. He had accepted it as his destiny, his flaw, his quiet burden. But looking at the woman he loved, facing the ultimate sacrifice to save her, something shifted deep within his chest. A dam, built of years of suppressed emotion, fear, and unspoken devotion, began to fracture. He didn't need to speak to rule. He didn't need to speak to fight. But he needed to speak to save her. He pressed his lips close to the narrow gap in the stone. He gathered all the air in his lungs, forcing it past his vocal cords, pushing past the psychological barrier that had bound him since childhood. It felt like tearing raw silk, a painful, burning sensation in his throat. "Go," a sound emerged. It was a voice. Raspy, deep, and unpolished, like an instrument that hadn't been played in decades, but it was clear. It was a voice. Aurelia froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked at the gap, her eyes wide with absolute astonishment. Julian, go. Aurelia, Julian said again, each word a monumental effort, yet ringing with a profound, undeniable authority. I love you. Go. The sheer emotional weight of his voice struck Aurelia like a wave. It wasn't the loud, arrogant shout of his father or brother, it was a voice filled with an ocean of truth, love, and protective fury. She realized then that her staying would only make his sacrifice meaningless. She squeezed his hand one last time through the gap. I will come back for you, she vowed, her voice fierce. I swear it. She turned and ran down the mountain slope toward the Solis border towers, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and a strange, miraculous hope. Inside the tunnel, Julian stood up. He turned away from the light, facing the darkness. He drew his stolen dagger. The dust was settling, and the torches of Cassian's men finally illuminated the cavern chamber. Prince Cassian stepped forward, his crimson armor gleaming in the firelight. He looked at the collapsed exit, then at Julian, who stood alone, defenseless against 10 armed guards. Well, Cassian mocked, stepping forward. Look at the tragic hero. Trapped like a rat. Where is your princess, Julian? Did she leave you to die in the dark? Julian did not move. He stood tall, his posture commanding, his eyes fixed on his brother with a cold, terrifying calm. It doesn't matter, Cassian sneered, raising his sword. Father wants you back dead or alive, but I think, dead, saves us all a lot of tedious paperwork. Guards, take him. As the guards stepped forward, Julian opened his mouth. Cassian. The single word echoed through the stone cavern. The guards stopped dead in their tracks, their eyes wide with shock. They looked at each other, then at Julian, wondering if they had imagined it. Cassian froze, his sword lowering slightly. His face turned pale, his arrogant smirk instantly vanishing. What? Who said that? I did, Julian said. His voice was growing stronger, resonance returning to his vocal cords, vibrating with the authority of a true king. The silence is over. Chapter 7. The verdict of steel. The shock in the cavern was absolute. To the guards, it was as if a statue had suddenly begun to speak, or a ghost had taken physical form. The legend of the mute prince was deeply ingrained in Oakhaven lore. To hear him speak with such clarity and commanding depth struck an instinctive fear into their hearts. Don't just stand there, Cassian screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and sudden panic. He's a traitor. He's using witchcraft. Kill him. The guards hesitated for a fraction of a second, but their training kicked in. The foremost soldier lunged forward, thrusting his spear toward Julian's chest. Julian, his senses heightened by years of silent observation, moved with fluid grace. He sidestepped the spear thrust, grabbed the shaft, and used the soldier's own momentum to slam him into the stone wall. He twisted the spear from the man's grip, turning it into a staff. 2 more guards rushed him. Julian parried a sword strike with the wooden shaft of the spear, swept the legs of the second guard, and delivered a powerful strike to the helmet of the first, sending him crashing to the ground. He was not a brute warrior like Cassian, his style was precise, calculated, and efficient. He used his opponent's weight against them, navigating the tight spaces of the cavern with a master's spatial awareness. Within minutes, 4 guards lay groaning on the floor. The remaining soldiers backed away, looking at Julian with newfound respect and terror. Fools, all of you, Cassian roared. He pushed past his men, drawing his own broadsword, a masterfully crafted blade with a golden hilt. If you want something done right, you must do it yourself. Cassian lunged at Julian with a ferocious overhead strike. Julian raised the spear shaft to block, but Cassian's heavy sword sheared right through the wood, cutting it in half. Julian rolled to the side, avoiding the follow-up slash, but he was now disarmed, holding only a broken piece of wood. You think a few words make you a king? Cassian hissed, circling Julian, his eyes burning with jealousy. You are still the broken prince. Father never loved you. The kingdom laughs at you. Cassian delivered a rapid succession of strikes. Julian dodged and parried with the remaining piece of the wooden staff, but the sharp steel cut into his velvet tunic, leaving shallow gashes on his arms and torso. He was being driven back against the collapsed stone wall. Die in your silence, Cassian shouted, lunging with a fatal thrust aimed directly at Julian's heart. Julian didn't dodge. Instead, he stepped into the attack, tilting his body slightly. The blade pierced through his shoulder, a searing pain exploding through his nervous system. but it was a calculated sacrifice. By letting the sword embed in his shoulder, Julian trapped the blade. Before Cassian could pull the sword out, Julian lunged forward, grabbing Cassian's throat with his left hand and driving his right fist, reinforced with the heavy iron ring of his lineage, straight into Cassian's jaw. The impact was devastating. Cassian's eyes rolled back, and he stumbled backward, releasing his grip on the sword. Julian pulled the blade out of his own shoulder with a grimace of agony and dropped it to the stone floor. Cassian collapsed onto the gravel, spitting blood, his armor dented and his pride completely shattered. He looked up at Julian, who stood over him, blood dripping from his shoulder, holding the golden sword of the air. The remaining guards dropped to their knees, lowering their weapons in total surrender. Suddenly, a loud commotion echoed from the cavern entrance behind them. The sound of many hooves, clinking armor, and the bright glare of dozens of torches filled the tunnel. King Aldous himself rode into the cavern, flanked by the Grand Vizier and a massive contingent of the royal guard. The king had followed the trail, furious and demanding answers. The king dismounted his horse, his heavy boots crushing the gravel. He looked at the scene before him, the collapsed wall, the defeated guards, Cassian bleeding on the ground, and Julian standing tall, holding Cassian's sword. What is the meaning of this? King Aldous bellowed, his voice shaking the cavern. Julian, you dare attack your brother? You dare escape your confinement? Julian looked at his father. The blood flowed from his shoulder, but he felt no weakness. He stepped forward, his eyes locked onto the king's. He did not use gestures. He did not look for a journal. Father, Julian said. The word hit King Aldous like a physical blow. The old king stumbled back a step, his mouth dropping open, his eyes widening in complete, absolute shock. The entire royal guard gasped in unison. You speak, Aldous whispered, his voice trembling, losing all its usual booming arrogance. I speak, Julian said, his voice steady, echoing with a quiet power that commanded the room. And it is time you hear the truth. Julian pointed the tip of the sword at Cassian. The treason was not mine, nor was it Princess Aurelia's. It was Cassian's. He forged my cipher, planted the military maps in her room, and attempted to incite a war with Solis to satisfy his own lust for glory and jealousy. He lies. Cassian cried out from the floor, his voice desperate. Father, he uses magic. He is a traitor. Julian looked at the Grand Vizier, who stood trembling behind the king. Vizier, examine the maps found in the princess's room again. My brother used the imperial cipher from my old journals, but he made a critical error. He used the third quarter registry numbers that were only updated after my journals were locked away in the archives. Only someone with access to the current war room records could have drawn them. Only Cassian. The Grand Vizier's eyes widened. He looked down, refusing to meet the king's gaze, his silence confirming Julian's words. He had known of the discrepancy but had been bribed by Cassian to remain silent. King Aldous looked from the vizier to Cassian, who was now sweating profusely, unable to offer a coherent defense. The truth, laid out with Julian's meticulous logic and spoken with unyielding authority, was undeniable. The king looked back at Julian. For 24 years, he had despised his son's silence, viewing it as a sign of weakness. Now, hearing him speak, he realized that Julian's mind was sharper than any blade, his honor untarnished, and his strength greater than any warrior in the realm. Julian, the king breathed, a wave of profound regret washing over his face. I was blind. Before the king could say more, a loud blast of a horn echoed from outside the collapsed wall. It was the horn of Solis. The sound of heavy rocks being shifted from the outside reverberated through the cavern. Within moments, a section of the collapsed wall was broken through, revealing the bright afternoon sun. A troop of Solis knights, clad in silver armor, stood at the opening. At their head was Princess Aurelia, her dark hair flying in the wind, a sword drawn in her hand. She had returned with her father's vanguard to save him. She looked into the cavern and saw Julian standing alive, his voice having delivered him from the shadows. Julian dropped the golden sword. He walked toward the opening, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. He looked at Aurelia, and a soft, genuine smile crossed his face. I told you I would hold them, Julian said softly. Aurelia dropped her sword, running into his arms, ignoring the blood and the dust, holding him as if she would never let him go. Chapter 8. A new song for Oakhaven. A year had passed since the events in the Jagged Peaks. The kingdom of Oakhaven had changed dramatically. King Aldous, broken by the betrayal of his younger son and humbled by his own past blindness, had voluntarily abdicated the throne, retiring to a quiet monastery in the southern hills to seek peace. Prince Cassian was exiled to a remote island fortress, stripped of his name and titles, left to reflect on his arrogance in isolation. Today, the Great Hall of Oakhaven was filled to capacity, but the atmosphere was completely different. The roaring, chaotic noise of the past had been replaced by an elegant, respectful attentiveness. The walls were decorated with vibrant tapestries depicting scenes of nature, philosophy, and peace, gifts from the kingdom of Solis. At the front of the hall stood Julian, wearing the royal robes of the King of Oakhaven. His posture was regal, his hazel eyes bright with wisdom. Beside him stood Queen Aurelia, her hand resting comfortably in his. Their alliance had not only brought peace between the two kingdoms but had united them into a prosperous commonwealth. Julian did not speak often. He remained a man who valued observation over declaration. But when he did speak, the entire kingdom listened with absolute devotion. His words were chosen with precision, filled with weight, justice, and compassion. He ruled not with the volume of his voice, but with the depth of his character. The court musicians began to play a soft, beautiful melody, a song composed by Julian himself, transcribed by Aurelia. It was a song that carried no lyrics, only the pure, soaring resonance of strings and flutes. Julian turned to Aurelia, looking down at her with a love that had grown stronger with every passing day. He reached out and gently plucked a white camellia from a vase near the throne, handing it to her. Aurelia smiled, her eyes shining with tears of joy. In the language of flowers, the white camellia signified perfected loveliness and unyielding devotion. She took the flower and leaned close, whispering against his cheek. Long live the king. Julian took her hand, squeezing it gently. He didn't need to say a word. In the quiet sanctuary of their shared hearts, their love was a song that would echo through the history of the realm forever, the eternal legacy of the prince who loved in silence.